Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our session today. My name is Sibelan Forrester. I am this year the past president of the Association for Slavic, East European, and Eurasian Studies, and I teach Russian language and literature at Swarthmore College in Pennsylvania. It is my pleasure to be presenting four extremely interesting speakers today. We've asked them to keep their comments to 10 minutes each, but then there will be time for a little bit of discussion among the speakers, and then we will entertain questions from our audience. Our first presenter today is Carina Karapetian Giorgi, who is Chair of Social and Behavioral Sciences at Antelope Valley College, and also serves as a faculty member in the Department of Sociology. Karapetian Giorgi currently focuses on community partnerships that aim to support students of color, low income, first generation, and homeless student populations. Karapetian Giorgi's a PhD in sociology with an MA in queer studies, gender, sexuality, and culture. They are currently working on 2 LGBTQ biographies, and they've written, lectured, and delivered presentations on topics such as Armenian female fedai fighters, tasseography, the Armenian genocide from a feminist perspective, and transnational Armenian female migrant laborers. Carina.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you for the space and invitation to engage in uncomfortable conversations and anecdotes with me regarding intersectionality, scholarship, and marginality. My first project, entitled Gender and Migration, Armenian Women's Experiences, examined Armenian women's traditional roles being renegotiated through labor migrations to the United States between the 1990s through 2010. The aim of this research delved into Armenian women's lived experiences as migrant laborers who are forced to leave their homes and work abroad in order to financially sustain their families back in Armenia. This work also examines the intersectionalities of Armenian nationality in the context of women as transmigrant workers. I explore the ways in which Armenian women's traditional roles in the family and labor migrations have clashed within the past few decades, resulting in the cultural condemnation of Armenian women and ultimately blaming them for ruining the nuclear traditional family by seeking work abroad. Armenian women migrants carry contradictory expectations with them when they seek a better life in another country. They balance multiple identities as survivors, descendants, mothers, caretakers, workers, and preservers of culture and homeland, all while trying to find a decent paid work to ensure their family's survival. This study was undertaken primarily because the lives of Armenian women were rarely addressed and discussed in their scholarship on migration, diaspora, labor, and gender. But in general, I found that Armenian women's lives and theoretical questions of gender had largely been sidelined, and that when and if they are referenced, Armenian women have a tendency to be presented as immutable, along with a series of implicit assumptions that are not analytically discussed or unpacked. Additionally, portions of Armenian women's histories remain hidden or missing from the larger body of texts, which have not taken the complexity of their lives and experiences and histories into critical consideration. In November 2014, I was a panelist at the MESA, Middle Eastern Studies, Armenian Studies Conference. This conference was significant because we were approaching the centennial anniversary of the Armenian genocide. I delivered my presentation on a critical reexamination of the Armenian genocide to highlight these gaps, specifically honing in on the oversimplified portrayal of Armenian female survivors by continually pigeonholing them into an overarching victimization objectification binary. Female survivors are either portrayed as murdered or raped, clustered with children and thus infantilized, or sold into sex slavery. And although this was an atrociously realistic fate for many women during the genocide, the consequence of these descriptions tends to accentuate Armenian women's apparent passivity as they are perpetually confined to these ongoing symbolic narratives of violations against Armenian nationalism. I drew attention to 20th century feminists like Serpihi Dusap and Zabel Yasayan, who documented women's support and resistance in defending the city of Van during the genocide. Additionally, I discussed the ignored accounts of Armenian female survivors who opted to stay with their new Turkish husbands and families because the prospect of returning to their violent and abusive Armenian husbands or families were too intolerable for them. While Armenian women, often with their half-Turkish children, were entirely rejected by their Armenian families because they were branded as stigmatized as damaged goods with their interracial children who were equally rejected as Turks or otars, which means foreigners or others. As I continued to use words and phrases such as feminist framework, queer lens, while delving into the accounts of sexual assault and trauma that Armenian men were subjected to during the genocide, audience members began chanting the word amot, which means shame in Armenian. In that moment, I was being explicitly shunned and disrespected, and so I ended the presentation by spotlighting a female Fedai, Aguline Tatulyan, who famously was quoted in the LA Times for declaring if Ronald Reagan had any doubt that a genocide had taken place in 1915, that she would show him her bullet wound that had been lodged in her hip for several decades and tell him what she had witnessed. Following the end of my presentation, we were about to enter the Q&A session, and one of the panelists loudly stated, Carina, number one, everyone knows that Reagan was very supportive in acknowledging the Armenian genocide, so I don't even understand your closing remark. And why can't you just write about Armenian families surviving the genocide? Why do you have to go in this direction? Then another panelist intervened who happened to be a non-Armenian white American scholar who insisted that I should be shown fairness and respect. And even though my colleague had good intentions, the atmosphere became even more tense and layered as a white Westerner was demanding some decorum from his Armenian male colleagues in the middle of Mesa ASA conference. A few months later, following that conference, I basically attended and I was a panelist at the Crossing the Centennial, the historiography of Armenian genocide being reevaluated. And I delivered a presentation on critically re-examining the female Fedai fighters through a genderqueer feminist lens, hoping to disrupt some of these national representations and narratives that were basically produced through the presentation of these Armenian female Fedai fighters. And a prominent genocide scholar asked me, I would say one of the most prominent genocide scholars asked me why I insisted on portraying Armenian women as Amazonians. Another audience member told me not to confuse my own queer identity with the Armenian female Fedai. And one last insult, a scholar questioned my claim that I was the descendant of the most famous Armenian female Fedai, Sosi Mayrig, and Sosi happens to be my great-grandfather Hirac Karapetian's aunt. So while I intellectually know all the systematic gatekeeping mechanisms in place that continue to regulate and entrench Armenian women's identities and gender roles via heteronormative patriarchal standards of traditionalism and authenticity as a part of a larger institutionalized nation state building project, as a genderqueer butch dyke, half-breed Armenian academic, it is mentally and emotionally painful and exhausting to be a living, breathing symbol of perversion of the genocide and its aftermath. This reminds me of Kenji Yoshino's text Covering, as he explains that as a POC queer cisgender academic, he must constantly cover and negotiate his ethnicity, race, and queerness in order to navigate the landscape of being discredited versus being discreditable in an attempt to protect his legitimacy as a legal scholar. With this in mind, I turned my attention to a few top-tier US academic journals and reluctantly began to submit my articles. And the feedback I received from the reviewers were outrageously racist, demeaning, and confirmed my worst fears. One of the reviewers challenged the genocide altogether. They said that I should get both sides of the stories to seem more balanced about the events of 1915. Another reviewer accused me of orientalizing myself, which apparently, according to a lot of my Southwest Asian colleagues in Middle Eastern studies, was actually a pretty common comment that I should get used to eventually. While a third reviewer claimed that I needed to pay more attention to men's roles in certain Armenian matrilineal practices and rituals that were obviously dominated by women. I contacted the editor to the journal to file a complaint, and he told me that he didn't know enough about Armenian matrilineal practices or rituals or Armenian culture for that matter in order to validate my complaint. As Bell Hooks reminds us not to linger in spaces that continue to marginalize you, instead encourages us to pick up a pen and write and create our own space. So I serendipitously met a wonderful academic human being who will be presenting in this series, Tamar Shirinyan, who reached out to me with a proposal of creating a special issue for the Journal of Armenian Review entitled Queering Armenian Studies, which ultimately became a collection of dynamic articles, essays, and stories that examine Armenian culture through a queer lens. When we first pitched this idea for a queer special issue, the journal's editors embraced it as a collection of LGBTQ articles, not entirely understanding the queer theoretical dimension of our proposal. And so ironically, this lack of cultural and theoretical literacy, this time, worked out to our advantage and an effort to produce the special issue. As a contributing author, my article entitled Intuitive Knowledge, the Queer Phenomenology of Armenian Matrilineal Rituals of Tasseography examines the practices of tasseography or coffee ground reading from the perspectives of queer phenomenology and feminism. It explores women's coffee-mediated exchanges of information, networking, and intimacy, which disrupt time and space of domesticity while disorienting hegemonic culture. The collective projects of traditionalism, authenticity, patriarchy, nationalism, and trauma are used to normalize understandings of the past, and they reveal a much larger colonial undercurrent that continues to permeate and police critical conversations in mainstream Armenian studies. That's why it's imperative for indigenous and intersectional frameworks to disrupt the Eurocentric dominance over cultural distortion, deculturalization of Southwest Asian Armenian scholarship. And of course, representing Armenian women, very important, and to continue to unsettle notions of legitimacy and authority. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Karapetian, Giorgi. That was extremely interesting. Our next speaker is going to be Joseph Lenkart, who is head of the Slavic Reference Service, SRS, and associate professor at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. He provides vision and leadership for SRS and the library summer research laboratory program, which I highly recommend, in support of Russian, East European, and Eurasian studies, or REES, scholars. He's the chair of the Committee on Libraries and Information Resources, CLEAR, for the Association for Slavic, East European, and Eurasian Studies.
Thank you very much, Professor Forrester. I would like to very much thank the University of Pittsburgh, specifically the Center for Russian, East European, Eurasian Studies, and the other centers supporting this great initiative. And I hope we can have more conversations like this. I also would like to thank Dr. Magdo and also the Inter-Asian and Uralic National Resource Center at Indiana University. And let me not forget the other colleagues who are participating in this discussion. So I'm delighted to be here. My initial comments, because we are anchored by this experience that is the pandemic, this ongoing experience, and whether it exposed exacerbated pre-existing institutional, structural, systemic discrimination and inequality in societies across the world. And how can we forget the images that we've seen? Whether it be the ability to order groceries from the comfort of your car, to a student waiting for a better wireless connection during the online teaching, which still continues, or the haunting images that we've seen of burials, whether open or done in a better setting. These haunting images of especially around the world, different communities, different ethnicities, different cultures, all are asking us or encouraging us to think about the future space that we want to, this vast post-pandemic space that we're still debating, and I hope we can continue to debate and create it so that it is more of an inclusive space for all of us to exist, to discuss, to investigate, to disrupt, and to challenge whether the accepted orthodoxies or fresh ideas coming from all fronts. My research has encouraged me to not only look at our region that we together investigate different disciplines, but it also has taught me about how I can help contribute to shaping better research environments for scholars, but also to help improve the research process as well. So I'm coming from my research is coming from two perspectives. One, looking at underrepresented regions, ethnic groups, and cultural groups, specifically through printing and publishing, and not only the nature of their founding, but also their relationship to center periphery, but also the center periphery within the peripheries, right? And also the institutions that were established to not only record, to preserve, but also to interact with the knowledge that is housed in these institutions. And the other aspect of it is, I'm a librarian, and my research also focuses on how can we create inclusive research environments for all scholars, and this is an important aspect. I'm currently running a pilot program for doctoral students, and specifically looking into the many facets that goes into their doctoral research experience, and so. And this is doctoral students across the board, not tied to any specific discipline, and also the overarching user experience, as library people would refer to as, and different types of users and their needs. And so and one of the things that has been extremely rewarding as one dives into the first component of my research, which is printing and publishing tied to specific ethnic and religious minority presses, is that the incredible richness of voices. We can immediately see the variety, the disagreements, the expansive narrative that goes into whether it may be a national newspaper, Jewish newspaper, let's say, in the Russian Empire, or to the underground publication, let's say in Uzbekistan, and we're looking at, let's say, for the image right now that is streaming of Langston News in Ashgabat, Turkmenistan. And who is going to record such experiences? We have a rich repository of images that's been that we witnessed these past 3 years and stuff. Who's going to record them? And specifically, who's going to record the experiences of underrepresented communities, not just here in the U.S. but around the world? And that is an important question that I connect to both the historical part of my research, but also in the present. And there is also a personal experience that is connected to my research, and this is something that I feel immensely proud of, which is I'm an immigrant. And the Slavic Reference Service has 3 individuals, full-time individuals, who are immigrants themselves. And so this is a fantastic experience to dip into as as I and my colleagues conduct research, specifically the numerous diasporas, and of course ethnic and cultural minority groups who are, let's say, if not documented, perish in terms of in print and documentation, right? So that's where we're coming from. The pandemic also revealed a part that was already visible, and I think in addition to the immigrant experience, it allowed me to see it more clearly. Let's say it was more clearly visible. That is, of course, I'm referring to class and where one lives, geography. And we also started to see during the pandemic words, terminology that was used for scholars from around the world. You saw affiliated scholars, you saw unaffiliated, you saw funded, not funded, visiting. You saw that person is an independent scholar. You also saw someone is an international based on how much access they could get to a specific source or a specific program. And you also started to hear declarations of if something is global, something is local, how we all belong in a globalized society together. So we saw contradictions. We saw possibly hypocrisies in all of this. And so how did we respond? How did I respond? And one of the ways that I responded is that a research project that I'm currently working on with my colleagues, Eva Rogar and Catherine Ashcroft, is to really begin the conversation about how do we provide an inclusive space for scholars from around the world to collaborate and provide a supportive environment for them to collaborate. And this is, we're starting a research cluster in Central Asia where the main focus is representation of Central Asian scholars in this research cluster. So it is an international project that we hope to have, which will lead to, of course, hopefully a published monograph, as well as articles in the Slavic Review and other journals as well. So we are taking concrete steps, and since I have 2 minutes, okay, and so one of the things I'm hoping, as at the institutional level, is that we can also start a conversation about the post-pandemic REIS field. How will it look like? Where do we want to go? What is currently working? What is not working? And how we could create a collective strategy to create that space across institutional and geographic spaces. And I think we've always been hesitant because although physical structures currently are not providing the support we need, let's create that space through collective strategy. We do not need to wait for our physical institutional structures. We're not bound by them. Let's create that institutional and space, whether virtually, which has been a boon during this pandemic. So I hope we create it through dialogue on the post-pandemic REIS field. Thank you. Looks like I'm out of time.
Thank you very much, Joseph. That was extremely interesting. Thank you for those thought-provoking questions at the end of your presentation in particular. I am happy to introduce our third speaker today, Pavel Levitsky, who is lecturer and researcher at the Chair for Comparative Central European Studies of the European University Viadrina in Frankfurt, Oder. He studied ethnology and cultural anthropology at the University of Warsaw and gained his PhD at the Institute for European Ethnology of Humboldt University in Berlin. His research interests cover embodiments of Europe and Europeanization from race-critical, gender and post-colonial and post-imperial perspectives. And I'm going to skip the information about his publications, rather rich information that is in the publicity about this session, and welcome Pavel to speak.
Thanks, Sibelan. Thank you for invitation, and thank you, Shoshana, also for organizing, and also thanks to all other panelists. I'm really happy to be here and to be able to talk about, I think I'm going to make a plaidoyer for decolonial race-critical perspective on Central and Eastern Europe. I'm interested in Europe and visions of Europe, how they are created. And I was looking at this in a special issue I brought out with my colleagues of a journal, Intersections, where we look at reciprocal entangled productions of Europe from race-critical perspective, while looking at intersections between gender, sexuality, and race. And as a continuation of that research, I recently wrote a paper on LGBT-free zones in Poland, where I'm looking at them also from race-critical perspective and also looking at imperial genealogies present, I think, in these LGBT-free zones. So in this paper, I'm analyzing the language of the notions that were passed by these communities and regions who declare themselves to be LGBT-free zones. And if you look at it more carefully, this language is, full of war and defense and full of defense of moral superiority, or our moral values, and I frame it if you look at it as from a race critical perspective, you can see it as a claiming to whiteness, as a claim to superior position. You can also frame it as a backward, Poland has this backward homophobic regions and communities that are, they don't know gender equality or stuff like that, which is also in a way hierarchical hierarchies imposing discourse that also wipes out the histories of gender equalities or socialist gender discourses. But you can also look at it exactly from post-imperial or decolonial perspective and see it as emanation of years of economic deprivation, as an answer to years of economic deprivation, or as a response to that Western discourse on gender that is bashing allegedly, backward Eastern Europeans. And also, if you look at these notions were also initiated by an organization that is acting globally, has networks globally. So it's not only a peripheral phenomenon that you can just mark as being peripheral. So I think, from this perspective, from this decolonial perspective, you can see that these LGBT-free zones is a response to this racist, gender racist discourse coming from the West. But the existence of these LGBT-free zones is also somehow politically supported by the current Polish government, and that has also, this discourse on being morally superior, of defending the Christianity as against the secularized and demoralized West. So there are also ideas about Europe on the national level connected to these gender discourses. And I think, I think this perspective shows that, the intersection of race, gender, and sexuality can bring, a bit different perspective on the dynamics that is going on in Europe. If you look at Hungary, there is a similar dynamic. There are also, if you look from race critical perspective, you can see also that there is anti-Semitic legacies to these LGBT-free zones. Interesting fact is that they emerged in regions that were populated by majority or in vast majority by Jewish population before the war. And also, if you think about Hungary and Poland, these are countries that have imperial history. So there's a lot of tendencies, to have this moral or just superior position, cultural superior position. Now, racist discourses tend to invisibilize themselves and, to claim or to wipe out their racist history or their existence. And I think we need to, exactly bring this race critical perspective more into academia, which is very much present, I think, at least at my university, which is a small university, on the fringes of the German Republic and Poland. It's on a border between Germany and Poland. And I can see still very much resistance towards talking about racism and race, and particularly in this Central and Eastern or European context, because we're all free from racism in Germany or in Poland. I think anti-Semitism took really big part of the discussion about racism, but maybe somehow precluded the discussion about other racisms present in the society. But I think this also, the consequence is also that there is no sensitivity for these issues also in the academia. So, and also there is a hierarchy of epistemologies, and maybe not much space given to other positionalities and histories. And I think, how can we cope with this apart from what I said, including more race critical perspective, is to include also people we're studying into our research designs, in order to give them more voice, to include teaching on positionalities, in order to reveal the hegemonic epistemologies, or more inclusive, action-oriented research, particularly in anthropology, I guess. I think also that, universities are in very much pressure. We need to produce applicable knowledge that is, applicable in economy or in politics, and that in a way already reproduces hegemonic knowledge that prevents also existence of other positionalities and histories within the academia. And regretfully, this also finds reflection in the employment policies. So we're employees based on merit, but the access to resources, to producing valuable research is made invisible. So I think we have to be just careful about that. Yeah, I think I'm going to just finish here. I'm really happy to hear your questions and positions, and thank you for giving me the opportunity.
Thank you, Pavel. Very interesting indeed. And now I'm happy to present our fourth and last speaker, last but not least, Olga Porovosnyuk, who is postdoctoral researcher, research coordinator, and lecturer at the Department for Social and Cultural Anthropology at the University of Vienna. She received her doctoral degree from and previously worked as a senior researcher at the Institute for Ethnology and Anthropology of the Russian Academy of Sciences in Moscow. Her research interests include the issues of post-socialism and post-colonialism, infrastructure and development, identity, ethnicity, and indigeneity, population dynamics, and gender relations in Russia, especially Siberia, and in the circumpolar north. Once again, I'm skipping some other information so that we can get right to the presentation. Olga.
Thank you very much, Sibelan, for the introduction, and thank you very much to Pittsburgh University and to Dr. Zsuzsanna Magdo for organizing this very exciting and important session. I'm happy to be here, and today I would like to speak about post-socialist women and their trajectories, sharing perspectives both from my ethnographic field and academic fields in two different national contexts. I started as a social anthropologist among indigenous communities in my home region in East Siberia, and focusing on the issues of post-socialism and transformations, I drew attention to increasing gender asymmetries in residence and migration, educational and occupational patterns among indigenous women and men. That sparkled my interest in intersections between gender, ethnicity, and indigeneity in post-socialist Russia, as well as in other post-Soviet spaces later on. I introduced the notion of gender shift in my research to address the situation when women tended to leave their remote communities in the north, but also in other places, striving for better education than men, and migrating to this near or farther centers of economy, education, and culture. And more recently, I also contributed to the expert report on gender equality and empowerment in the Arctic, where I addressed the issues of growing gender gaps and inequalities in Russia. To contextualize what I call the gender shift in the Russian North, I had to look into the legacies and transformations of the Soviet gender and ethnic policies in post-Soviet Russia. In my research, I argued that the collapse of the Soviet state, on the one hand, seemed to remove the institutional and ideological underpinning of the traditional gender relations, roles, and identities. And at the same time, it did not eliminate the path dependency in public perceptions, expectations, and norms associated with gender roles, but also colonial categories that were imposed on the ethnic groups, especially on ethnic minorities, as well as institutional setups for these reproduced that allowed the production of these perceptions and stereotypes. Soviet and especially indigenous women in the North were the targets of emancipation policies of this and construction, so-called cultural construction policies of the authorities. These policies yielded a number of positive results. Women became more educated and in general and eligible for high positions that had been previously occupied by men in their communities. And at present, one can notice average high level of education among women, activism and political representation, especially at local and regional levels. But unfortunately, in general, in Russia, in particular in remote northern regions, there are still a very visible signs and indicators of gender inequality. Women in Russia and in its Arctic and northern regions still experience the Soviet legacy of so-called double burden and discrimination by employers, limited education and wage employment opportunities that push them out from their local communities. Now I want to also in parallel share perspectives from and some experiences from my academic fields. I graduated from a university in my native town of Chita in East Siberia, where I majored in North American studies. This brand new, for that time, program shaped really my understanding of cultural diversity and introduced me to the concepts of feminism and gender equality and intersectionality that have never been so really widely circulating in public discourses in Russia, especially also in post-Soviet period and especially now. And I further developed my interest in social and cultural anthropology back in my university years, and that actually motivated me to look for opportunities for my own continued education in that field that were not available in my native town. So I had to look for those opportunities somewhere else, and my life and academic trajectory brought me to Moscow, where I settled and started a job. I started actually my studies in graduate school at the Institute for Social Anthropology and Ethnology at the Russian Academy of Sciences, where I then worked continuously as a researcher and a senior researcher. So while some Russia's social science centers, particularly sociological centers, have significantly contributed to research on gender, LGBT, and intersectionality, anthropology and ethnology have been lagging behind on that front. Russian anthropologists who did use gender, ethnicity, age, and other categories to analyze social structures and inequalities in other, primarily non-Russian societies, often failed to address these issues in their own academic community. For example, the existing occupational hierarchies and gender-specific stereotypes have been widely circulating in this community and were only to some extent addressed by female academics primarily. At the institutional level, there's still a lack of mechanisms that support employment policies oriented at hiring and inclusion of the diverse staff with different backgrounds than the mainstream expectations are. In 2015, I developed collaborations with my Austrian colleagues, and that brought me further to work at the University of Vienna in Austria, working as a postdoc researcher, lecturer, and more recently as a project coordinator on an European project. I have been focusing on the role of infrastructures and sustainability in the remote communities in the Arctic region. And judging by my personal and professional experiences, the Austrian academic community is much more vocal about the issues of discrimination by gender and sexuality and race, as well as the research on these issues has been much more advanced than in Russia so far. Most of the academic staff at the University of Vienna with whom I've been contacting or collaborating are strong supporters of feminist values and rights of minorities. In practice, however, it does not mean that the policies of inclusion are implemented flawlessly during job searches or appointments at permanent positions, as well as there are other factors of discrimination, especially of the international colleagues that challenge the adaptation in academia. Still, I think there's been a lot done in that respect in comparison to the Russian academic context. Well, to conclude, I wanted to draw some quick comparisons between, in addressing actually the question of this session of how do we deal with inclusion of the diverse academic staff. In post-Soviet Russia, I would argue that the rapid transformations had, on the other hand, to somewhat reconfigured traditional patriarchal gender and ethnic hierarchies. At the same time, they reinforced social inequalities that actually led to further marginalization of minorities and even ideological critique of feminist and indigenous or sexual minorities' rights, especially under the Putin's regime more recently. Here, educating the values of cultural and gender and ethnic diversity and developing the language even to address these issues such as a gender violation of minority rights are most urgent tasks. And the situation in Austria is quite different as it has a long history of feminist and minority rights movement where intersectionality have been, and the values associated with it have been widely circulating. The majority of the Austrian researchers and students are vocal about these inequalities, and in order to address though the same problems at the institutional levels, much more, of course, and still more discussions and public attention and also collective actions are needed to integrate and support the students and colleagues with marginalized backgrounds, as well as with culturally different and linguistically different backgrounds. Well, thank you very much for your attention. I would be happy to talk more about this and to hear your questions.
Thank you so much, Olga. That was extremely interesting. I cannot resist doing a brief recap of the high points I heard in the talks by these four speakers. Olga, I think, emphasizing the impact of research on individuals in societies that may not previously have had access to that kind of information. And I think it's important to say, needing to leave home in order to get the education and then the support that you want for your intellectual labor. very important. Joseph underlines, I think this is uncontroversial, the vital importance of gathering evidence, gathering testimony, and good record keeping, making information about the past and present elsewhere available to anybody who needs that. Also, the intersectionality, attention to intersectionality will help all of this information make sense. I think librarians are the superheroes of some of the work that we do. Carina, I'm afraid painfully now, is describing the gatekeeping that goes on in marginalized communities as well. And the impact both on our understanding of the history and cultural traditions of those communities, but also on people in the present, including scholars and teachers, as she points out. And Pavel makes the point about a hierarchy of epistemologies, which typically is parallel to other kinds of hierarchies. And I liked your mention, Pavel, of the after effects of imperial history as well, that the idea that one can just declare what the situation is and declare that this is a queer-free zone or what have you, that perhaps reflects certain historical habits. Thank you all very much. Were there any comments from our presenters to one another to start? Or maybe I should open the question and answer if anyone in the audience has a question, and our presenters may throw a hand up as well. Here's a question. Jenny Suchlin, thank you so much. Would love to hear ideas for how you see incorporating your interventions into the classroom. So speaking from a US context, but I think this would be interesting anywhere that you teach. Anybody want to address that one? I'm happy to start, although I hope my colleagues will jump in and interrupt me. I think one essential thing is to make clear that attention to intersectionality, attention to the histories of marginalized communities, attention to even the names of the individuals in the class is extremely important. That if we do that, it shows that this is the assumption, this is kind of the baseline of what an appropriate education is about. Karina.
Yeah, I basically second everything you just said, but also what I would do is I would connect it and I would get to know my students in a way where I understand where they're coming from. And so it's relatable information. So I can connect maybe something that is something that I wrote about or I researched about that connects right back to their communities as well. And to, sort of use intersectionality as a bridge of understanding why this is significant, why this scholarship was significant for me as an Armenian scholar, as a queer Armenian scholar, and how this could be really significant for you as somebody who is in the Latinx community or the African American community.
Are there other comments on this question or other questions for one another?
And I think if I may just jump in and add a comment, and I think adding context, I think it's extremely important, especially in the teaching environment, and placing it, of course, in an objective, neutral place of inquiry is extremely important, especially now when everything seems to be politicized almost immediately.
Mm-hmm. No, I think this is a place where someone who has professorial authority, and that's another question in this precarious moment, who has to assert this is indeed the way we're going to do things, and this is kind of the neutral starting point. Olga, did you have a comment?
Yes, I just wanted to intervene into this discussion. I think it's really important to engage your students from the very beginning of the class, as we said, from the introduction of themselves, giving them a little bit more space, much more space than it's used to be before. Then they really take on more active roles in participating in the process of learning. Actually, we both learn. We as teachers also learn a lot from our students, especially if the students come from a variety of different cultural and other backgrounds, as it is right now in many universities also across Europe. there are large exchange programs such as Erasmus exchange between the European universities. We also very often have very interesting and diverse audiences to teach. That is also a good motivation for us as teachers.
Yes, very much so. And I think another comment that Joseph made kind of in passing, that how many of us are immigrants, or how many of us have parents who are immigrants, in my case, again, that crossing boundaries ourselves, I think, may make it more immediately obvious that these questions are important questions. Do we have anything else from our loving audience? Or Olga, Pavel, Joseph, Carina, would you like to address one another?
No, but I am excited to address Brendan's question in the chat. That's the next question. In all your experiences, what is the best way to apply theories such as intersectionality, which were designed for North American, Western European context, when doing research in the New East context? And that's a great question. And this is, somebody said, give the students space. And so what I would do is actually give students space to actually identify those intersections, and also the language that they're going to use. In other words, they come to an agreement collectively on the terms and conditions of that, of how they're going to engage with those intersections. And that's, because I wouldn't agree 100% that the intersectionality is just exclusively North American, but I can see how it can be dominated in discussion by North American narratives, certainly. So I would give that space for students to basically define and their own culture and situated in their own cultural context.
Yeah, Olga, Pavel, would you like to address Brendan's question?
If I may, I would like to follow up on what Carina has just said, because I think it's very true that the concept of intersectionality, as we know, stems from the North American context, and also it's widely associated with the realities and categories of identification existing in that context, which might be different from those from in Europe and certainly in Russia, for example. And that is very important to be critical, reflective, in the sense of being reflective upon what are those categories in every society. If we can draw parallels, if we can compare, well, maybe race in that respect is somewhat of a more importance of a category as an ethnicity in European context. For example, if we say we want to practice post-colonial perspectives, what are the internal categories? I think they might vary across different contexts.
Pavel.
Yeah, I'm not sure I know what New East is. The more so it's in the quotation marks. But I assume it's, everything that is east of Germany and east of Austria. Is it? Oh, can I understand it like this? Anyway, I found in my work very productive to focus on critical whiteness studies, since it's, it's not of course, it doesn't mean that there is no anti-Black racism in Central and Eastern Europe, but this category of critical whiteness gives you a perspective of these different shades of whiteness between East and West, and how these categories, how these colors are produced. So I would just add that.
Super, thank you. A question landed in the answered category from Jake Robertson, which I'll read out, although I see that Joseph is typing an answer there. As a professional theater maker and a Soviet history scholar, I'm very interested in using the creative arts in collaboration with academic research. Do you think that creative and artistic methods for expressing scholarship, performing arts, visual arts, etc., can be helpful tools in broadening access to research and foster inclusivity, challenge orthodoxies, and gatekeeping? I think absolutely. Do you want to address that?
Yes, and I want to say that our special issue, the first queer studies issue in Armenian studies, that's exactly what we did. We invited artists, folks that were actually theater performers, put their play, list their play down as a form of storytelling within our larger, contributions of articles and essays and stories. And it was a dynamic collaboration. It gave us, different types of voices and modes of transmitting, some of our critical understandings, ideas, and lived experiences, and intersectional, from an intersectional lens. So I thought it was really, and then of course one of great, fantastic queer artists did our cover for the special issue. So this is a really special issue for us. That was really, it just adds so much more texture and richness.
Yeah, just to add up something to that. I think yes, exactly. I mean, these discriminated or marginalized cultures are not that represented, and they are often represented by people who are not as proficient in the language, or not even in the ways to speak and to express themselves verbally in written or oral language. So it's super important to include these types of teaching or methods in that.
Olga.
Yeah, I would also like to add my example on that. I think it's a good point, and using the visual methods to both for representation of underrepresented groups. For example, in my case, we had a project again with indigenous people and industrial projects that were encroaching basically on their culture. We what we did is that we co-created actually a media portal based on cartographic storytelling, where we were where the stories of narratives of the people, of the local residents, were interwoven into the maps and archival photos, and that made up a really nice kind of portal for a wide public to use in two languages, in Russian and in English. And then based on that portal, further, we published also a dissemination popular science brochure that we circulated as a thank you to local communities. And we received such a very warm words and thank yous from the people we've been working with, that I think this is also a very important and rewarding element of your research when you reach out for wider audiences, but also to those people who've been working with you and sharing with you their knowledge and perspectives, and whose culture you are writing about, and who are collaborating with you, co-creating this knowledge to represent themselves as well, taking part in that.
Yeah, I want to make one quick comment apropos of Jake Robertson's question. I think much as teaching has shifted over the past several decades from the professor droning, and the students just passively absorbing. I remember when I was taught Russian, professor читает курс, студент слушает курс. And I noticed that today, even our native speakers of Russian are not saying я слушаю курс, they're saying я беру курс. So much more active, much more engaged. But I also teach at an institution where, because of its Quaker heritage, for a long time, the various fine and performing arts were not taken seriously as intellectual endeavors. They were kind of fun things you did to decompress after chemistry, I guess. And so I think managing to involve theater, managing to involve visual arts, music, dance, all of those things, if it's done in a meaningful way and in an intentional way, a way that's not trivializing, that's not, oh, now we're going to put on our Lemko costumes and dance. If it's done with thoughtfulness, it really does expand the possibilities for students to engage with the intellectual questions as well. Turning to Tetiana Samiliv. Thank you so much to all the scholars for presenting today. Do you have any suggestions in how to engage your classmates and professors in these conversations and explaining the complexity of our region? I'm a Ukrainian student in the US and often have the responsibility in having a stance on the politics and realities in the whole region, and they often forget how different the region is. And what is the best way for me also to learn more about the region? I'm excited to read your research after this talk. Good, Tetiana, this is exactly what we want. I think As a Ukrainian student in the US, you are finding yourself in the position of the one Black student in class, of the one Latinx student in class, of the one student who's willing to come out as queer in class, that many, many, many people have been stuck representing. Does anyone have advice here?
Well, I think my sage advice, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
But my sage advice is first of all, you shouldn't carry that burden. You don't feel like that's the expectations, that even though you might feel like you're placed in that position. But however, if you have that standpoint perspective to express it, I don't know if every conversation is fair and balanced. It needs to be fair. Like, the gatekeepers of this journal telling me, of a very top tier, high ranking journal telling me that I need to be balanced about the genocide. This is the type of, colonialist nightmare horror that is not fair. And so, I think it's important for you to express your standpoint on your own terms when you are, willing to do that, not feeling burdened to do so.
Yeah, Pavel and then Joseph.
Yeah, I think I would try to see the region, whatever region, actually, not only Central and Eastern Europe, but any region, in its connections and in its entanglements, and try to omit the perspective that there is something super unique or super special about it, but to see that the things that are going on in this particular region are a reflection or somehow connected to things that are happening somewhere else. And, looking from this perspective just makes it more easier and interesting, I think, for everyone.
Mm-hmm. Joseph.
Thank you for that question, Tatiana. And Sibelan mentioned that this role is isolating, and and it's never easy to be in this place. I've been there, believe me. And so one suggestion, not directly, but is to form your support network. I'm talking, of course, about taking advantage of not only the services offered by some of my colleagues here, but for example, the Slavic Reference Service, you can rely on us. We not only provide programming, but also extensive list of resources that you could use to incorporate, especially if you're in a environment where you're asked questions, you could just rely on some of the resources for Ukrainian studies, as well as whatever you're doing with your personal research.
One wonderful thing about this series of webinars that has been organized by Reese at Pittsburgh and the Association for Slavic, East European and Eurasian Studies is that they've been recorded. So one of the resources you can find is these online recordings that might in fact address precisely the question that someone in class has to ask. So I hope that was all helpful. And Jenny has another comment, agreeing that intersectionality is an analytic that can travel. Yes, absolutely, with due awareness of the local situation. God knows that people from North America can go bombing in with their own categories. But at the same time, returning to Jenny, I think it is important to not erase the important legacy and ongoing impact of Black feminist theorizing. Absolutely. Also, that the uprisings in the US against anti-Black racism fueled reflection across social, cultural, and professional contexts to reflect on intersectionality. Absolutely, absolutely. And there is, in fact, from a webinar last year, a recording that you can find. I don't know, actually, Zsuzsanna perhaps will tell us when this is over, where the list of previous recordings is, but absolutely the impact of Black feminist theory on any consideration of intersectionality, any consideration of how racism is constructed and carried out in practice. And that's another important thing. Put bell hooks on your syllabus, for God's sake. no one will regret reading bell hooks. Thank you. And we have another comment from anonymous attendee. Thank you all for raising these important issues. As a Russian native, I sadly had to leave Perm, my native town, to travel to Moscow and later to the United States to gain awareness and theoretical knowledge on the successful examples of movements that allowed different minority groups, LGBTQ primarily, to gain rights and voice that is actually heard. It is heartbreaking to observe the current Russian reality that is still suffocating and dangerous for minorities. I'm hopeful that sessions like this one will allow enough people from the Russian Federation to raise awareness and gain the feeling of being supported, so my natives find the courage to speak up and act. Thank you. That is a lovely comment. Any comments in reaction?
Yeah, that actually maybe speaks also to my presentation about Russia and the current realities that are, can be characterized really by, especially the recent years, to this kind of a return or retraditionalization of gender roles, the homophobic and anti-LGBT moods and discourses that are unfortunately being propagated through mediated and that unfortunately also, as I could see, that impact many people and their way of thinking about the difference based on race, gender, and sexuality, for example. And I agree absolutely with this comment. It's hard for the people who are different sometimes in many contexts to it takes at least a lot of courage to sort of carry this identity, to show, to be true to yourself, to show who you are publicly without being kind of concerned about the consequences that it might have, if not on your job, but then on your kind of personal connections and opportunities. And this is a situation, of course, that has to be addressed both on the institutional and also on personal level, as I suggested in my presentation, that there's a lot to be done in Russia in terms of raising public awareness about these discriminations, about mediating counter discourses to these currently predominating moods and politics, and to support in these discourses as well. And also on the personal level, I think that there's a lot needs to be done to educate, to propagate, to support the people, to develop the understanding of the people who are different from the mainstream society in a way, to get more inclusion. So it's a lot of things to be done here, and this is not an easy issue that will be solved in the next years, I think. And I have also many kind of acquaintances and former colleagues and friends who had to actually leave the country because of their queer identities, because of also their feminist values, simply because of the fear of the persecution of for their activist kind of work, and NGOs recently that have been unfortunately very often declared to be foreign agents by the recent law, that insane law that was enforced and that actually kills the civil society in Russia. This is a very sad kind of processes that have been taking place in the recent years. And I don't have a clear kind of a solution to offer here. I can only really kind of share what I have to say in response to this comment.
Mm-hmm. No, I think that you're right. There's not a clear solution, but what we can do is one person at a time pursue education, one person at a time support our students. And I want to mention, apropos of that our host behind the scenes, Zsuzsanna Magdo, has put a link in the chat, should be visible to everybody, with the recordings from the Race in Focus series, and click on that. Also, you can just probably Google a couple of obvious terms and it will take you there. So we're at least managing to create an online library that can be found through search engines that's supplementing the other kinds of information. So I hope that someone who starts by finding one of these recordings will then take the step of going to a librarian and maybe even making it to the Slavic research service at UIUC, which has been so helpful to many of us. Are there other questions either from our attendees or from our respected panelists?
Just wanted to say that this is a really exciting panel in the sense that we all have our own research perspectives and interests, but at the same time, this is an area, an important conversation to have. And I think this whole series on intersectionality and how it could be useful and applied for transforming the academy and academia and for educating the values of diversity. I think this is an important initiative that should be certainly carried on. And yeah, wanted to once again thank the organizers for invitation to participate in this.
Our presenters were so very, very good at respecting the time limits that we actually have some time left over. I do want to repeat a comment I heard at the last ACES conference that interestingly, as we strive to become more aware of intersectionality and marginalized groups, either as participants in this whole Russian, East European and Eurasian region, or as students who want to learn about it, it's fascinating that class is one of the things that seems to be least well handled, when in fact, isn't class all over the place in historical study of Eastern Europe and of Russia and of Central Asia, all over the analysis by historians from the region. So there's another thing to keep in mind that hasn't been as foregrounded, I think, in the present in our profession as it ought to be. All right, friends, this is your last chance. All right, I am going to thank our panelists one more time. I would like everyone to send huge virtual applause. Thank you to all of you very much. Thank you to those of you who attended. And we hope to see you at the upcoming session, which is in 1 week, talking about globalization, gender, race, disability, and politics, which features another fascinating selection of colleagues from here and abroad. Thank you all. Thank you all for your presentations.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Thanks.